In February of 1957, Philadelphia sat under a low, gray sky. The winter had been bitter, and the city wore it heavily. Streets that once bustled with daily life seemed quieter. The cold pushed people indoors, and the open spaces between neighborhoods grew still and empty. Toward the edge of the city, near a road called Susquehanna, there was a stretch of overgrown land, a place where trash and forgotten objects often ended up. It was a piece of land few had reason to cross unless they knew exactly where they were going. It was here that someone left a cardboard box. The box sat among the brush and debris, exposed to the cold air and light snowfall. At first, it looked like nothing out of the ordinary. It was battered and worn, carrying the faded logo of a department store that had once sold children's bassinets. Days passed before anyone looked inside. When they finally did, they found the body of a young boy. He appeared to be between 3 and 6 years old. His body was uncovered by clothing and lightly wrapped in a thin, worn blanket. He was small for his age, with a recent haircut that left his hair uneven and close to the scalp. The discovery was handled with great care. Police were called to the scene, and investigators moved cautiously through the muddy ground and frozen patches of undergrowth. There were few clues nearby. No footprints that could be followed, no clear sign of who had left the box there. The boy was transported to the city morgue where an autopsy was conducted. It revealed signs of chronic malnutrition and physical injuries. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma. Some of the marks on his body suggested previous injuries, but none pointed clearly to how long he had been suffering. There was no identification found on him, and no missing persons report in Philadelphia or the surrounding areas matched his description. Efforts to find his family began immediately. Flyers were printed, sketches distributed, and hospitals and schools were contacted. Funeral directors were asked to view the photographs in the hope they might recognize the child. Every possible step was taken to learn who he had been, but each search came back empty. The box itself, once a container for a new bassinet, offered a small lead. Investigators tracked it to a local retailer, but the store had sold many of the same boxes and did not keep records of individual customers. Without a purchase record, there was no way to know where it had gone or who had bought it. The investigators working the case called him the boy in the box, not out of cruelty, but because it was all they had to call him. Without a name, it was difficult even to write the reports that were piling up in the precinct files. The city's newspapers picked up the story. Residents who read about the discovery were struck by its sadness and its strangeness. People who lived near Susquehanna Road were interviewed, but few had seen anything unusual. A few reported hearing noises in the night, but nothing that led investigators any closer to understanding what had happened. Despite the efforts of police, the press, and volunteers, no one came forward to claim the boy or explain his presence. As the weeks turned into months, and the months into years, the case grew colder. The boy was buried with dignity at Ivy Hill Cemetery. His grave was simple, marked with a small stone. Over time, members of the community returned to place flowers there, honoring a life they had never known, and a mystery they had never been able to solve. Still, the case was never truly forgotten. Detectives returned to the file again and again, reviewing every piece of evidence, hoping that something overlooked might reveal the answer. Volunteers dedicated years of their lives trying to trace any family ties. As forensic science advanced, samples were preserved carefully in the hope that one day, new technology would allow the boy's story to be completed. For a long time, there was only patience. No new leads came. No new faces appeared to explain what had happened. But the work continued quietly behind closed doors as generations of investigators carried the memory of a boy they had never met and a name they still hoped one day to learn. And in time, science would catch up with hope. It would take more than 60 years, but the day would come when the boy in the box would finally be given his name back. The days following the discovery were marked by quiet urgency. Inside the Philadelphia Police Department, investigators assigned to the case began working methodically, trying to piece together the small fragments they had. There was no certainty about the boy's age. but early examinations suggested he was likely around 4 to 6 years old. He was smaller than other children his age, leading to early speculation about whether malnutrition or illness had played a role in his life. His hair, which should have grown freely on a child so young, had been trimmed very short, the edges rough, uneven. It wasn't the careful cut of a barber, but something done hurriedly, perhaps with household scissors. The boy had been found without clothing, wrapped only in a thin, worn blanket. Its pattern was faint from use, and no unique markers or labels could be identified that might tie it to a home or store. Everything about the scene suggested an attempt to erase connections, an effort to leave no traceable thread back to whoever had last cared for him. From the start, investigators understood they were working against a silence that would be hard to break. At the station, sketches of the boy's face were prepared, hand-drawn because the technology to create detailed forensic reconstructions did not exist yet. The artists worked with care, trying to capture a likeness that might stir recognition in someone. Copies were printed and distributed across Philadelphia and into surrounding towns and counties. Flyers hung in grocery stores, bus stations, diners. They were tucked into newspapers, pinned to the boards outside police precincts. The boy's features stared back quietly from the pages. Small, round face, a slight downturn to the mouth, deep-set eyes. Detectives visited schools, asking teachers and administrators whether they had noticed a student disappear, or whether a child had simply stopped attending. They checked orphanages and foster homes, comparing records and making quiet inquiries. But no one came forward. No family called to report a missing child. No caretaker stepped into a precinct to say a boy they once knew had vanished. For a case like this, the lack of response was almost unthinkable. Children did not simply go missing unnoticed. But here it seemed one had, and the investigators were left to follow the faintest suggestions of leads, hoping that persistence would reveal what luck had not. They examined the cardboard box closely. It had originally contained a bassinet sold by a local store, J.C. Penney, a well-known name at the time. Investigators traced the manufacturer, contacted the store, and attempted to track purchases. But sales records from 1957 were handwritten, incomplete, and rarely preserved for long. Without a specific purchaser or identifying receipt, the box provided no clear answers. It was one of many objects in the city's daily flow of commerce. Thousands had been sold. Tracking this particular one was, investigators realized, like trying to follow a single leaf blown by the wind. Still, they documented it carefully. Every item found at the scene was photographed and cataloged with painstaking precision. The blanket was analyzed for fibers, but with the technology of the time, testing could only reveal basic information. Its material, its general age, nothing more. It yielded no brand, no point of sale, no direct tie to a household. The field itself was canvassed thoroughly. Police and volunteers walked it side by side, pushing through the brittle winter underbrush, scanning for any additional evidence. There was nothing. No discarded clothing, no dropped personal items, no clues. If the boy had been carried to the field, there were no footprints that survived the weather. If a car had parked nearby, any tire tracks had long since been washed away by melting snow and rain. The place was as empty as if nothing had ever happened there at all. Within a week, frustration began to set in. The newspapers reported on the case with a tone of disbelief. Journalists referred to the boy as a mystery, a sorrowful puzzle. Editorials spoke of the tragedy of a child so isolated in death that even his name was beyond reach. Still, officers kept going. They considered broader scenarios. Could the boy have been from another state, transported here by someone passing through? They notified national missing children registries, though such systems were limited in scope and accuracy at the time. They revisited every hospital report involving young children. They spoke with medical examiners and social workers. They expanded the search to include neighboring states. Nothing. In the meantime, the boy's body was prepared for burial. No family came to claim him, but there was still a sense among those involved that he deserved dignity. The money for the burial plot and small ceremony was raised by donations. His grave was marked simply but carefully. For some detectives, the case became personal, not because of the lack of progress, but because of the quiet injustice that the boy remained unrecognized. A child who had once had a life, however hard or short, now reduced to a case file and a photograph. And though Philadelphia carried on, its streets growing busier again as winter loosened its grip, the lot on Susquehanna Road stayed empty. The boy's presence remained, silent, waiting. Inside police headquarters, the file grew heavier. More sketches were drawn. New flyers were printed. The photograph of the boy's face, taken in the morgue under gentle conditions, circulated among professional circles. Funeral homes, doctors, foster care workers, in case a delayed recognition sparked something new. For years, nothing did. The investigators who had first worked the case began to retire or transfer. New officers read the file with respect, adding their notes to the margins, but finding little more than what had been gathered at the start. It was a case that lived between generations, neither forgotten nor actively pursued each day, but always present, waiting for the tools or the information that might one day lift the silence. In the decades to come, technology would evolve beyond what anyone in 1957 could imagine. Methods would be developed that allowed for identifications once thought impossible. Samples carefully preserved from the boy's autopsy would survive into the modern era, waiting quietly for the day when they could finally speak. But in those first long years, all anyone could do was wait and hope that one day the boy's real story would find its way back to the surface. Time moved forward in Philadelphia, but the case remained, a quiet current beneath the city's busy surface. Every so often, a new detective would take it on, combing through the old photographs and notes, hoping to see something missed. For a while, the hope was that somewhere a family would come forward, that a distant relative would recognize the sketches, or a neighbor would recall a missing child not properly reported, that someone's memory would stir enough to bring light to a boy left behind. But year after year, that hope faded a little more. The city grew, neighborhoods shifted, people moved away, and memories, even of painful things, softened and changed with distance. Still, some investigators and volunteers refused to let the case slip into full obscurity. They continued to keep the story alive in small ways, through articles, local news segments, and anniversary remembrances. Each February, a few people would gather quietly at the boy's gravesite at Ivy Hill Cemetery. They would place flowers, stand for a few minutes in the cold, and then walk away, carrying the weight of questions that had no answers. The marker on the grave remained simple. It did not offer a name. It simply bore a blessing, a recognition that even without an identity, the boy deserved dignity. In the 1970s, forensic science began to change. Slowly at first, advances in fingerprint technology, blood typing, and trace evidence gave investigators new tools. For many cold cases, these developments brought long-awaited breakthroughs. But for the boy in the box, the problem was not the lack of physical evidence. It was the absence of connection. Fingerprints, dental records, and basic biological information were collected carefully in 1957 and preserved. But without any living person to match them to, the data remained silent. The boy had not been reported missing. Or if he had, the report had long been lost, overlooked, or hidden. In the absence of a starting point, there was no way to move forward. Without a family to ask questions of, without a school that remembered his absence, without a hospital record to tie to his face, there was only the field, the box, the blanket, and the body, and the city moved on. By the 1990s, a new generation of investigators had come into the department. Technology had advanced rapidly. Computerized databases for missing persons and unidentified bodies had been created. DNA testing, once a distant possibility, had become reliable. National coordination between police agencies had improved. For the boy in the box, these changes offered a small window of hope. In the mid-1990s, the body was exhumed carefully. Investigators hoped to recover better samples for DNA profiling. The exhumation was carried out respectfully. A quiet process, early in the morning, attended by only those directly involved. The boy's remains were transported to a specialized lab, and new samples were taken. For the first time, a DNA profile could be built. It was a profound step forward, because now there was a new avenue, a possibility that science might do what memory and traditional investigation had failed to achieve. If a close relative's DNA existed in any database, or if in the future one were to be added, the boy could be identified. The samples were preserved, carefully cataloged, and returned to rest at Ivy Hill Cemetery. This time, the boy's grave was given a new headstone, acknowledging the advances in technology that might one day speak for him. Hope flickered again. As the years turned into decades, interest in the case ebbed and flowed. True crime writers, amateur sleuths, and local historians all revisited the story. Some proposed theories. A few pointed to possible suspects: families known for abusive behavior, orphanages that operated without strict oversight, transient communities that might have hidden terrible secrets. But none of the theories could be proven. Most were built on speculation, not fact. And the investigators who had lived closest to the case knew that speculation was a dangerous path. Without evidence, without confirmation, attaching a name or story to the boy would be another kind of injustice. And so the case remained protected, carefully documented, not rushed, not filled with guesses, just a quiet acknowledgement that, for now, they still did not know. Meanwhile, the city around Ivy Hill Cemetery continued to change. Buildings rose. Neighborhoods evolved. Children grew up in Philadelphia without ever hearing the story of the boy in the box. But in a few corners, in precincts, in volunteer groups, among the small gatherings at his grave, his memory stayed alive. The photograph of his young face remained pinned to bulletin boards, featured in anniversary articles, and tucked into the files of cold case detectives who, even if they never solved it themselves, refused to let it be forgotten. Because even without a name, even without answers, the boy mattered. And the search for his identity never truly stopped. It simply waited, carried forward by those who believed that time, and eventually technology, would close the distance between who he was and the story he deserved to have told. The silence was deep, but it was not absolute, and in time it would begin to shift, quietly, steadily, until it finally gave way to the truth. By the end of the 1990s, new possibilities had begun to open for long unsolved cases. Forensic science had made quiet but powerful advances, and for the investigators who had carried the story of the boy in the box for decades, there was reason to look again at the evidence that had been so carefully preserved. The boy's remains had been respectfully exhumed years earlier to allow for better preservation and future testing. His DNA profile, though limited by the techniques available at the time, had been secured and stored with the hope that technology would eventually catch up to the needs of the case. It was a hope that, for a long time, remained distant. But over time, the slow development of forensic genealogy offered a new way forward. Unlike traditional forensic matching, which required direct comparisons between known individuals, genealogical research allowed scientists to compare small segments of shared DNA across wide populations. This made it possible to trace family lines outward, even when no immediate relative could be found in any database. It was not an exact science. It demanded patience, long hours of archival work, and careful interpretation of scattered connections across generations. But it had already begun to resolve cases once considered impossible, and so the boy in the box was given another chance at being known. In the early 2020s, Philadelphia authorities partnered with forensic genealogists who specialized in these difficult, sprawling investigations. DNA from the preserved samples was extracted again, with greater precision than had been possible in previous decades. From that extraction, profiles were built that could be compared to public and private genealogical databases where individuals had submitted their DNA to learn about their ancestry. Every match, no matter how distant, was examined with care. Researchers spent months tracing lines backward through time. They studied census records, birth certificates, marriage announcements, and death notices. Every fragment of data was weighed, and every possible link was mapped out to build trees that could explain how certain segments of DNA were shared. They approached each connection methodically, never rushing, knowing how easy it would be to force patterns that were not truly there. The work remained slow, but it was steady. Names that had once been distant possibilities began to cluster together in ways that could be traced. Historical documents filled in the gaps left by genetic information alone, allowing the outlines of a family to emerge where before there had only been silence. Throughout the process, the investigators maintained the same quiet respect that had characterized the case for decades. No conclusions were shared until they were verified beyond doubt. No information was leaked or presented to the public before the work was complete. Their commitment was not to solving the case quickly, but to solving it properly, so that the boy who had waited so long would be honored with truth rather than guesses. Outside the walls of the laboratories and police precincts, life in Philadelphia moved on. New buildings rose over old streets. Generations who had never heard of the boy in the box lived their lives unaware that, quietly and patiently, a search was unfolding that carried the weight of 65 years of questions. The grave at Ivy Hills Cemetery remained a point of quiet remembrance. Volunteers continued to place flowers there. Strangers who knew only the barest outline of the story would stop sometimes and stand in front of the stone that bore no name, only a blessing. Inside the investigation, there was cautious optimism. The pieces were fitting together with more certainty. The lines were becoming clearer, and somewhere at the end of all the searching, a name was beginning to take shape, not through speculation, but through evidence that could be traced, tested, and confirmed. There was no need for bold announcements or sudden revelations, only the quiet knowledge among those working the case that, for the first time in a very long time, the search for the boy's identity was not standing still. It was moving forward, step by careful step, toward the truth. The final steps toward identifying the boy in the box were taken with the same quiet patience that had marked the entire investigation. By early 2022, after months of careful genealogical work, a family line had been constructed that pointed back to a possibility investigators could not ignore. The information suggested that the boy had been born to a young woman from Philadelphia in the early 1950s. Records from the time were limited, but fragments of documents, birth certificates, hospital logs, and census updates began to form a more solid picture. Slowly, the focus narrowed to one family. Living relatives, located through the genealogical research, were contacted privately. Some responded willingly, offering DNA samples for comparison. Others were more reluctant, cautious about the implications of old family stories they might only half remember or had never been told at all. Throughout the process, respect for privacy remained paramount. Investigators knew that the discovery of a long-lost connection to a public mystery would not be welcome news for everyone involved. Still, the scientific work continued, with each new DNA sample strengthening the picture that was taking shape. By the middle of 2022, the evidence was strong enough to move forward with confirmation. The boy's DNA, combined with historical documentation and supporting genealogical trees, had led investigators to a name. After 65 years of silence, the boy in the box would finally be known. His name was Joseph Augustus Zarelli. He had been born in January of 1953, just a few years before his life ended. The circumstances of his birth were complex, involving a young mother, a family under pressure, and a time when unwed pregnancies often led to difficult and sometimes secretive decisions. Joseph's early life appeared to have been unstable. Records indicated that he may have spent time in various care arrangements, possibly moving between family members or unofficial custodians. What remained unclear was how, and under whose care, Joseph's life had ended. The genealogical evidence had provided his name and his origins. It had not, however, answered the final and most painful questions about what had happened in the days and weeks leading up to his death. Those answers, it seemed, were buried too deep in history to recover fully. Still, identifying Joseph was not a small thing. It was the fulfillment of a promise made decades earlier by detectives, journalists and volunteers who had refused to let his case disappear. It was an affirmation that every person deserves to be recognized, no matter how much time has passed. The Philadelphia Police Department moved carefully in preparing the public announcement. They worked with forensic genealogists, legal advisors, and community leaders to ensure that Joseph's name would be released in a way that honored his life without causing unnecessary harm to surviving family members. The announcement was made in December 2022 during a quiet press conference. Officials shared the basic facts that could be confirmed. Joseph Augustus Zarelli had been born in Philadelphia. His identification had been made through the use of modern forensic genealogy. He had family living today, though out of respect for their privacy, names and detailed histories would not be released publicly. The mood of the announcement was reflective rather than triumphant. There was no sense of finality, only a sober acknowledgement that while one part of the mystery had been answered, many parts remained beyond reach. Reporters asked careful questions. Officials answered what they could. Joseph's name was spoken aloud, and for the first time, the city of Philadelphia could grieve him not as a nameless symbol, but as a real child who had lived, even briefly, among them. The news spread quietly across the country. Articles appeared summarizing the long history of the case and its resolution. Commentators reflected on the importance of persistence, of the role that evolving science had played, and of the human need to name and remember those who might otherwise be lost. At Ivy Hill Cemetery, where Joseph had rested for decades under a stone bearing no name, people gathered once more. They left flowers, small toys, and notes. They spoke softly among themselves. Some had known the story for years. Others had just learned it. But all seemed to understand the significance of the moment. Joseph Augustus Zarelli was no longer the boy in the box. He was a son, a member of a family, a child whose life, though cut short, had not been forgotten. In that small space between the rows of graves, among the winter shadows and the heavy stillness of the cold, there was a kind of peace. Not the peace of a solved case, but the peace of a name finally returned to someone who had waited far too long to be seen for who he truly was. And in that quiet acknowledgement, a long-closed chapter in Philadelphia's history began to settle into its rightful place. Not as a story of mystery, but as a story of memory, carefully preserved, and finally complete. The announcement of Joseph Augustus Zarelli's name marked a turning point, not only for the investigators who had worked for decades without answers, but also for the city of Philadelphia itself. For so long, the boy in the box had been a part of the city's quiet history, a symbol of something unfinished, a sadness that belonged to no one and everyone at once. Now that he had a name, the nature of the story changed. He was no longer an unknown child to be speculated about. He was a person with a beginning, and even though many parts of his life remained shrouded in unanswered questions, the simple act of naming him brought a different kind of weight to the case. The public response to the announcement was restrained. There was no outpouring of spectacle, no wave of sensationalism. Instead, there was a quiet respect, a shared recognition that something long overdue had been set right. Local newspapers printed thoughtful summaries of Joseph's story, tracing the history of the investigation and the painstaking work that had led to his identification. Editorials reflected on the importance of persistence, of carrying forward cases that seem impossible, of remembering that behind every file number is a life that once mattered. Television stations aired short segments that told the story with a tone of reverence, not drama. There was a conscious effort to maintain the dignity that had marked the case from the beginning. At Ivy Hill Cemetery, visitors came steadily in the days following the announcement. Some brought fresh flowers, placing them carefully at the base of Joseph's grave. Others brought small tokens, stuffed animals, handwritten notes, candles in glass jars. The items were left respectfully without fanfare. People stood quietly by the headstone, some with heads bowed, others simply watching the winter light shift across the ground. There was a sense that even though Joseph's life had ended long ago, the act of acknowledging him now mattered deeply. It was not about solving every detail of the past. It was about affirming that he had existed, that he was real, and that he would not be forgotten again. Within the police department, the mood was reflective. The officers and forensic specialists who had worked the case understood that bringing Joseph's name to light was only part of the journey. Questions still lingered. Questions about the circumstances of his death, about who had been responsible, about whether justice could ever be fully served after so much time had passed. Yet, there was also a quiet sense of fulfillment. Even if no charges would ever be filed, even if no full explanation could be written into the record, the identification itself was a kind of justice. It closed a wound that had remained open for too long. The detectives who spoke at the press conference chose their words carefully. They made clear that Joseph's living relatives had been approached with sensitivity and that their privacy would be respected. There would be no forced interviews, no demands for public statements. The focus would remain on honoring Joseph's memory rather than chasing after explanations that might never be fully known. Among the forensic genealogy community, the case was seen as a landmark, not because it had ended with a trial or a confession, but because it had shown that even after decades of silence, patience and science together could give a voice back to the voiceless. It was a reminder that cold cases are not just puzzles to be solved. They are real lives that deserve to be remembered. The family connected to Joseph's lineage responded quietly. There were no public statements in the immediate aftermath. Some relatives, once contacted, had expressed sorrow, but also surprise. For many, Joseph's existence had not been known, or had been buried in layers of family history too complicated to easily untangle. The circumstances of his early life were not widely shared across generations, and in some cases were likely lost altogether to time. Investigators chose not to release specific details about Joseph's biological parents or immediate family circumstances. It was a decision made out of respect for those still living, and an acknowledgement that whatever had happened in 1957 had left scars that did not need to be reopened for public consumption. What mattered most was that Joseph's identity had been restored. He was no longer anonymous. He was no longer a mystery filed away in the archives of the city. He was known, and in being known, he was honored. In the broader community, the identification of Joseph Augustus Zarelli prompted reflection. It stirred conversations about forgotten children, about the responsibilities communities have to the most vulnerable among them. People spoke quietly about the importance of remembering not just the high-profile tragedies, but the smaller, quieter losses that sometimes slip away unnoticed. For some, the story of Joseph was a call to continue advocating for the nameless and the missing. For others, it was a reminder that persistence matters, even when the goal seems impossibly far away. And for many, it was simply a chance to grieve a child they had never met, but whose story had, over time, become part of the city's own memory. The boy in the box was no longer a ghost. He was a boy with a history, however incomplete, and that was enough to change everything about the way his story would be remembered. Joseph's grave, once marked only by a simple inscription for an unknown child, now carried a deeper meaning. It was no longer the resting place of a mystery. It was the resting place of a boy whose name had been spoken again after 65 years of silence. In that act of recognition, something important had been restored. Not just for Joseph, but for everyone who had carried his story across the long, silent decades. The identification of Joseph Augustus Zarelli brought a quiet sense of resolution to one part of the story, but it also reopened old questions that had never been fully answered. Even with a name now attached to the boy in the box, the details of how he died and under what circumstances remained uncertain. Investigators knew that many of the individuals who might have been directly involved in Joseph's early life were no longer living. The passage of time had closed many doors. Witnesses had aged or passed away, memories had faded, and whatever records might once have existed were either lost, incomplete, or had never been created at all. Still, authorities made the decision to re-examine everything carefully. Detectives returned to the original files, rereading every statement, every theory that had been proposed over the decades. They compared the findings of the 1957 investigation with the new information gathered through genealogical research. They revisited the original autopsy report, knowing that while science had advanced, the physical evidence recorded at the time still told the clearest story available. The original medical findings remained consistent. Joseph's body had shown signs of chronic malnutrition. There had been bruises, both recent and older, suggesting a pattern of injury rather than a single moment of violence. The immediate cause of death had been determined as blunt force trauma to the head. None of these findings changed with modern review. What remained missing was the context. There were no verified records of Joseph's care in the years leading up to his death. No clear custody trail, no formal documentation that might explain who had been responsible for him in his final days. The scattered records that genealogists had uncovered told part of the story, but they could not answer the most important questions about how a small boy ended up abandoned in a box by the side of a Philadelphia road. Authorities approached surviving members of Joseph's extended family with care. Some relatives knew little or nothing about him. Others had pieces of family history that hinted at complicated circumstances, but could not fill in the missing years. In interviews, investigators encountered a pattern common in cases involving historical family trauma. Stories that were fragmented, memories that were secondhand, and the understandable reluctance of people to revisit painful or hidden chapters of their family's past. There was no indication that any living family members had direct knowledge of Joseph's death. The lines between what was known, suspected, or imagined had blurred too much over time. And without living eyewitnesses or preserved records, many of the questions about Joseph's life and death would likely remain unanswered. Still, the investigators pressed forward with what they could verify. They identified individuals who would have been closely connected to Joseph at the time of his death, even if only by circumstance or geography. They gathered information about family structures, about who lived where, about what social pressures might have existed in 1950s Philadelphia for a young, unmarried mother and her child. They considered the possibility that Joseph's situation had been marked by secrecy from the beginning, a private arrangement, a household under strain, a life lived largely out of public view. Throughout the renewed investigation, there was a strong sense of restraint. Detectives understood that naming Joseph had fulfilled a fundamental part of their mission, but assigning blame without clear, irrefutable evidence would serve no one. Speculation, even if well-intentioned, could not substitute for proof. They refused to build a narrative out of assumptions. Every step taken was measured against the standard that had guided the case from the beginning: dignity for the boy whose story they were telling. The Philadelphia Police Department made it clear that while the case remained technically open, the likelihood of formal charges being filed after so many decades was very small. The burden of proof, always high in cases involving death, was made even heavier by the passage of time and the loss of potential witnesses. Still, the investigation remained active in spirit, if not in constant daily motion. Tips continued to come in following the announcement of Joseph's identity. Some were vague, based on long-forgotten rumors or family stories. Others were more direct, offering specific names or theories. Each was evaluated on its own merits, carefully and quietly, with the understanding that even now, truth had to be separated from memory, suspicion, and imagination. For those closest to the case, the reality was clear. Identifying Joseph Augustus Zarelli had been a triumph of persistence and science. Understanding the exact circumstances of his death might never be fully possible. It was a difficult balance to strike, holding on to the facts that could be verified, while accepting that some parts of Joseph's story would remain beyond reach. In the city, public interest in the case gradually quieted. There were no calls for sensational investigations, no demands for further public disclosure. Most people seemed to recognize that the dignity of the boy, finally given back his name, was the most important legacy the case could offer. Journalists who covered the story focused less on speculation and more on the broader impact of the identification. They reflected on what it meant for long unsolved cases across the country, what it meant for families who still lived with unanswered questions, and what it meant for communities to remember those who had once been forgotten. The Philadelphia community, in particular, showed an instinctive understanding that the closing of Joseph's case was not about uncovering every detail, but about honoring the life that had for so long been reduced to a mystery. At Ivy Hill Cemetery, his grave continued to receive visitors. The items left behind changed with the seasons. Flowers in the spring, flags in the summer, candles in the winter, all small, human gestures for a boy whose life had touched people he would never meet, across decades he would never see. And so, even without every answer, Joseph Augustus Zarelli's story found its place. Not in the records of a court, not in the headlines of a newspaper, but in the quiet acknowledgement that remembering matters, that dignity matters, and that even when history cannot be fully repaired, it can still be honored with care. In the months that followed the announcement of Joseph Augustus Zarelli's identification, a quiet shift took place. The case, once defined by uncertainty, gradually became part of a broader conversation about memory, justice, and the slow, steady work of uncovering forgotten stories. Within Philadelphia, the response remained measured. There were no large memorials, no sweeping public ceremonies. Instead, there were smaller, more personal gestures. People visited Ivy Hill Cemetery in ones and twos, often bringing a single flower or pausing silently by the grave. For many, the act of recognition was enough. It was not necessary to have known Joseph personally to feel the weight of what his story represented. Some visitors had grown up hearing about the boy in the box from parents or grandparents. Others had learned about him only recently, drawn in by news articles or short segments on local television. Regardless of when they first encountered his story, they came now with a sense of shared understanding, that his life, once lost to anonymity, had been restored to the community in a way that carried real meaning. Among the law enforcement community, the identification of Joseph was seen as a quiet triumph. It reaffirmed the belief that cold cases are never truly closed unless every effort has been made to resolve them. It also highlighted the evolving role of forensic science, not as a tool for spectacle, but as a means to bring dignity to those who could no longer speak for themselves. Training programs for new detectives began to reference Joseph's case when discussing perseverance and the importance of careful evidence preservation. Young officers were reminded that patience, respect, and methodical work could, even decades later, bring long-forgotten cases back into the light. The story became not just a historical footnote, but a teaching tool for how to approach the weight of unsolved loss. In broader forensic circles, Joseph's identification stood as an example of how emerging technologies like genetic genealogy could be applied with care and ethics. His case underscored that such tools were not just about solving crimes, but about fulfilling deeper responsibilities to those who had been overlooked by history. No one working in the field overlooked the solemn nature of the achievement. There was satisfaction in the result, but also a recognition that it had taken more than technology to bring Joseph's name forward. It had taken decades of careful record-keeping, unwavering attention, and a refusal to let his memory be surrendered to time. For the families who had lived in Philadelphia during the 1950s, Joseph's story reopened quiet reflections on that era. It was a time marked by strict social expectations, when families often hid difficult truths out of fear or shame. The story of a child who had lived and died largely unseen reminded many of how easily vulnerable lives could be lost within the cracks of society. Historians and social workers reflected on how the case symbolized broader realities faced by children during that period. There were fewer protections in place. Reporting systems were limited. Cultural pressures often silenced discussions of family hardship or abuse. In that sense, Joseph's story became not just personal, but representative. A symbol of the many unnamed, unseen lives whose histories had been shaped by forces outside their control. Yet through the long efforts to name him, and through the respectful manner in which his case was handled, Joseph's story also became a symbol of what could be different. A reminder that it is possible to turn back toward the forgotten, even when the path is difficult and the outcome uncertain. In small ways, Joseph's name began to find its place in the public landscape. His grave marker at Ivy Hill remained a site of quiet pilgrimage. In local schools, teachers occasionally shared his story in lessons about history, justice, and persistence. Writers and journalists referenced his case when discussing advances in forensic science and the ongoing importance of caring for unsolved cases. Community groups involved in missing persons work cited the boy in the box when advocating for resources to continue investigating long cold files. The message was clear. Time alone does not erase the need for answers, and every life lost deserves to be remembered. Online, genealogists who had played a part in the case's resolution continued their broader efforts, working to connect unidentified individuals with names and families wherever possible. Joseph's case served as encouragement that even when progress is slow, it is not wasted. Every attempt matters. Every effort leaves a trace of care. For the city of Philadelphia, Joseph's story gradually settled into a different place. No longer an open wound, but not forgotten either. It became part of the city's memory, a quiet point of reflection on resilience, on the passage of time, and on the small acts of commitment that, when sustained across generations, can restore a measure of justice to those who had none. The boy in the box had once been a symbol of mystery. Now he was a symbol of remembrance. His name, once lost, now belonged to the living memory of a city that had, through steady hands and steady hearts, refused to let him vanish entirely. And in that quiet, enduring remembrance, Joseph Augustus Zarelli found his place at last. As word of Joseph Augustus Zarelli's identification spread beyond Philadelphia, the story began to quietly resonate in places far removed from the cold field where his life had once ended. Major national and international news outlets covered the development with a tone of reflection rather than urgency. Articles appeared in newspapers across the United States, and stories aired on television broadcasts in countries where the details of Joseph's case had previously been unknown. Each account carried a similar weight: the acknowledgement of a mystery that had endured across generations, and the patient, deliberate work that had finally brought it closer to rest. Writers focused less on the circumstances of Joseph's death, and more on the significance of giving a name back to someone who had been known only by an anonymous description for so long. Commentators described the case as a reminder of the long reach of memory, of the ability of science and determination to pierce even the most persistent silences. There were no bold headlines designed to provoke shock. Instead, there were quiet, detailed retellings of a small boy's journey from invisibility to recognition. In many of these accounts, Joseph's story was treated with a care that matched the tone Philadelphia had set. Journalists revisited the history of the case, outlining the decades of work by detectives and volunteers, and the new possibilities opened by forensic genealogy. They interviewed experts who spoke carefully about the limitations of technology, the importance of ethical handling of DNA evidence, and the need for patience when dealing with cases marked by profound gaps. The coverage also touched on broader themes: how communities choose to remember the lost, how families deal with histories that resurface after many years, and how justice can sometimes take forms that are not about punishment, but about acknowledgement. In the quieter spaces of public conversation, Joseph's story became a reference point, a way to talk about how the past is never truly finished, how even in a world that often moves quickly from one headline to another, there remains value in looking back carefully and in carrying unfinished stories forward with respect. For many who read or heard about Joseph for the first time, there was an immediate emotional connection. It was not rooted in sensationalism, but in something more basic: the understanding that every life deserves recognition. Readers from different cities and countries, from different backgrounds and experiences, paused to consider the life of a boy they would never meet. Social media discussions, usually fast and scattered, turned briefly inward. People reflected quietly on the power of names, on the meaning of memory, and on the unseen lives that history often overlooks. Some individuals shared their own family stories, tales of lost relatives, missing ancestors, and family histories long hidden by silence or circumstance. Others expressed gratitude toward the investigators, scientists, and volunteers who had refused to let Joseph's case be forgotten. The tone, almost universally, remained subdued and thoughtful. There was a shared recognition that the story did not belong to tragedy alone, but to resilience. In professional circles, Joseph's identification sparked renewed discussions about the future of forensic genealogy. Experts emphasized the need for careful standards, the importance of maintaining privacy for living relatives, the obligation to avoid speculation, and the ethical responsibility to treat each unidentified person not as a case, but as a human being. Workshops and conferences referenced Joseph's case when discussing best practices. Panels were organized to explore how law enforcement agencies and genealogists could collaborate more effectively while preserving the dignity of the individuals involved. In these settings, Joseph's name was not used lightly. He became part of a larger, ongoing effort to ensure that new technologies were used with care and respect, particularly for cases involving unidentified children. His story reminded those working in these fields that every entry in a database, every fragment of DNA, represented a real life, a real loss, and that the work of remembering must be approached with the same seriousness as the work of identifying. In Philadelphia, the impact of the global attention was felt quietly. The city did not seek to turn Joseph's story into a spectacle. Officials maintained their careful posture, choosing not to release sensitive family information or unverified historical details. The cemetery at Ivy Hill remained a place of private pilgrimage rather than public ceremony. Visitors continued to come, some leaving flowers, others simply standing for a moment, acknowledging the quiet importance of what had been restored. Community groups in the city began to organize efforts around the case, not to prolong the investigation, but to use it as an opportunity to raise awareness about missing and unidentified children nationwide. Fundraisers were held to support organizations specializing in forensic work. Educational events were planned to teach young people about the importance of persistence in seeking truth, even when the answers are slow to come. Joseph's name became a quiet banner for the importance of seeing the unseen, not only in cold cases, but in everyday life. As winter turned again over Philadelphia, the same heavy sky that had once hung over the empty field near Susquehanna Road now stretched over a city that carried Joseph's memory differently. He was no longer a question. He was a name, a history, a child whose life, however short, had left a lasting mark. His story had traveled further than anyone might have expected. Across states, across countries, across generations, and wherever it was heard, it carried the same message. That dignity matters. That patience matters. That every life, no matter how small, deserves to be known. In that understanding, Joseph Augustus Zarelli's story found not just its conclusion, but its rightful place among the many quiet legacies of those who, once unseen, are finally brought into the light. By the early months of 2023, the investigation into the life and death of Joseph Augustus Zarelli had reached a quiet resting point. Although the identification had been a breakthrough, there were limits to what could be known, and the Philadelphia Police Department approached the closure of the active case with the same care that had guided every step since Joseph's name was first spoken aloud. Internally, investigators reviewed every piece of evidence one final time. The original reports from 1957 were studied alongside modern genealogical records. Witness interviews, both old and new, were weighed carefully. Every tip received after the public announcement was assessed, recorded, and where necessary, followed to its natural end. The facts remained consistent. Joseph had been a young child at the time of his death. He had suffered from malnutrition and physical harm over a period of time. He had died from a blow to the head. He had been placed carefully in a box and abandoned in a quiet part of the city. What was missing was the identity of the person or persons responsible for his death. Despite the genealogical identification, the evidence needed to establish a legal case simply did not exist. No direct witnesses had come forward, and no forensic trail could bridge the vast gap between 1957 and the present day. The detectives who had carried Joseph's story into the modern era understood the distinction between closure and completion. Closure did not mean every question was answered. It meant that the most important promise had been kept. The boy had been given back his name. His story had been placed into the permanent record of the city, not as an unsolved mystery, but as a life remembered. And so, the Philadelphia Police Department made the decision to formally classify the case as inactive. It was not done with a sense of finality, but with a kind of careful reverence. The files would not be destroyed or forgotten. They would remain preserved, open for future review should new information ever come to light. But for now, the work of investigation was done. Joseph's memory would not be defined by the silence surrounding the circumstances of his death, but by the dignity restored to him after so many years. The final internal report on the case was prepared quietly. It detailed the timeline of the investigation, from the discovery of the boy's body in February 1957 through the decades of search efforts to the scientific breakthroughs that led to his identification. It included notes about the DNA analysis, the genealogical research, and the sensitive manner in which living relatives were contacted. It outlined the reasons why, despite all efforts, prosecution was not possible. The report was not intended for public distribution. It was placed carefully into the department's historical archives, where it would remain accessible to future generations of investigators and historians. There was no ceremony to mark the formal change in the case's status. No public announcement beyond what had already been shared. Only the quiet understanding among those who had worked so long that some stories, even when told with as much care as possible, would always retain a measure of mystery. And that was something to be respected rather than regretted. Outside the department, Joseph's identification continued to ripple outward in small, steady ways. Historical societies added his story to their records of Philadelphia's past. Local historians wrote careful accounts, ensuring that the boy in the box would not vanish from the city's collective memory again. Educational programs incorporated his case into lessons about forensic science, law enforcement history, and the evolving understanding of how societies respond to vulnerable lives. At Ivy Hill Cemetery, discussions quietly began about updating Joseph's gravesite. Plans were considered for a new marker that would bear his full name, not to rewrite history, but to bring the site into alignment with the new reality. That Joseph Augustus Zarelli was no longer an unidentified child, but a known part of Philadelphia's story. These plans were approached with sensitivity. There was no rush, no urgent campaign, only the thoughtful movement of those who understood that some acts of recognition take time, and that the act of naming was as sacred as the act of remembrance itself. Among the community, the final stages of the case's public life were marked not by fanfare, but by reflection. Local journalists wrote follow-up pieces, revisiting the impact of the identification months later. They spoke not only about Joseph, but about the volunteers, scientists, and officers who had made it possible. The focus remained on the importance of persistence, the quiet dignity of thorough work, and the enduring human need to honor every life with care. The city's conversations shifted from the urgency of discovery to the responsibility of memory. It was understood that Joseph's story, though no longer an open investigation, would live on in how people chose to carry it forward. Through education, through acts of kindness, and through the simple act of not forgetting. In the end, the boy in the box had not disappeared into the archive of forgotten cases. He had been seen, he had been named, and he had been given back a place in the world that had once lost him. As winter softened once again into spring, the cemetery at Ivy Hill grew a little greener. The flowers planted by visitors held their color a little longer. The small gifts left at Joseph's grave spoke not of loss alone, but of connection. It was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one written not by the circumstances of his death, but by the lives he had touched simply by being remembered. And through that remembrance, Joseph Augustus Zarelli would remain part of the living history of a city that, in the end, had not allowed him to be forgotten. After the public identification of Joseph Augustus Zarelli, the city of Philadelphia moved slowly and thoughtfully in adjusting the way it remembered him. His story, once confined to the realm of mystery and speculation, found its way into the broader memory of the city, not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a life to be honored. Within police departments and forensic circles, Joseph's case became a point of reflection rather than active investigation. His identification demonstrated how modern science, applied carefully and respectfully, could give dignity back to those who had once been lost to time. His story was included in trainings for detectives working cold cases, emphasizing the importance of patience, meticulous record-keeping, and never assuming that a case has no hope simply because many years have passed. Outside of law enforcement, community groups and local historians took quiet steps to ensure Joseph's story would not fade again. Historical societies incorporated his case into records of Philadelphia's post-war years, presenting it not as a tragedy alone, but as an example of how remembrance can stretch across decades when people refuse to give up. Libraries preserved articles, interviews, and public records, creating spaces where the full context of Joseph's life and identification would be available for those who wished to understand more deeply. At Ivy Hill Cemetery, plans moved forward for a new grave marker bearing Joseph's name. Rather than removing the past, the new marker would stand alongside the old one, acknowledging both the long years he was known only as the boy in the box and the final restoration of his full identity. The fundraising efforts to support the new memorial were modest and respectful, drawing support from individuals who understood that some acts of memory should be marked quietly, without spectacle. In local schools, teachers found careful ways to include Joseph's story in lessons about perseverance, forensic science, and ethical responsibility. Students were encouraged to think not only about the technical aspects of his identification, but about the broader human questions it raised. Questions about how societies care for the vulnerable, how silence can be broken, and how dignity can be restored even after many years have passed. Joseph's story also found a place in broader discussions about missing and unidentified persons. Advocates working on similar cases cited his identification as evidence that persistence matters, that technology must be used thoughtfully, and that behind every unsolved case is a real human life deserving of recognition. For families of the missing, Joseph's story brought a quiet form of encouragement. It reminded them that even when years pass without answers, there is always the possibility that someone is still working, that some part of the story might yet be uncovered. Throughout Philadelphia, the reaction to Joseph's identification remained subdued but enduring. There were no grand ceremonies, no monuments erected beyond the simple changes to his gravesite, but there was a collective understanding that something had been repaired. A loss that had once seemed endless had been brought, carefully and respectfully, into the light. Writers, historians, and community leaders continued to reflect on the meaning of his story in the years that followed. They spoke about how remembering matters, how even when history cannot answer every question, the act of searching, the act of speaking a name, carries weight. Joseph's life, though brief and once nearly forgotten, now held a place among the many stories that shaped the identity of the city itself. The landscape of Philadelphia continued to change, as it always had, but within that change, there remained places of stillness where stories like Joseph's were preserved. In the careful retelling of his story, in the small, steady acts of remembrance by those who visited his grave, and in the quiet adjustments made to how the city spoke about its past, Joseph's presence remained. He was no longer part of a case file stored away in archives. He was part of the city's memory, its history, and its reflection on the meaning of dignity, persistence, and care. And in that quiet, enduring presence, the long journey from anonymity to remembrance found its place, not as a final resolution, but as a lasting part of how lives, even interrupted ones, continue to matter. In the years that followed Joseph Augustus Zarelli's identification, his story remained quietly present in Philadelphia and beyond. No longer a mystery waiting for a solution, his life had taken its place in the city's collective memory, where it continued to be treated with the same careful respect that had guided the work of those who had fought for so long to restore his name. The cemetery at Ivy Hill became a place not only of remembrance, but also of reflection. Visitors who came to stand by his grave understood the significance of his story, not through grand public ceremonies or widespread commemorations, but through the simple fact that remembering him mattered. Flowers appeared regularly, left by people who had read about him, heard about him, or simply understood that a boy whose name had been lost for decades deserved to be acknowledged with quiet dignity. Within law enforcement, Joseph's case remained part of ongoing training and education efforts. Detectives and forensic specialists used his story as an example of how persistence, careful record-keeping, and respect for the lives involved could lead to long-awaited answers, even when the odds seemed small. He was not presented as a symbol of tragedy alone, but as a reminder that every case, no matter how old, carries the weight of a real person's life, and that those lives deserve every effort to be remembered and understood. Genealogists and scientists who had played a role in the case continued their work on other identifications, often citing Joseph's story as evidence of why even the oldest cases should not be abandoned. Advocacy groups for missing and unidentified persons used his case when calling for resources, improved systems of record preservation, and greater attention to unresolved histories. His identification provided a quiet, steady form of encouragement for those who continued to work in fields where results were never guaranteed, and where success often came only after years of effort. In schools, Joseph's life and the work that led to his identification were included in lessons that touched on forensic science, ethics, and community responsibility. Educators approached the subject carefully, presenting his story not as a sensational event, but as an opportunity to understand the importance of compassion, patience, and perseverance in the face of long-standing silence. Philadelphia itself carried the memory of Joseph Augustus Zarelli with a kind of quiet maturity. The city did not turn his story into something larger than it was, nor did it allow it to be forgotten. Instead, his name became part of the background of a city that had witnessed his loss and, eventually, restored his presence. Over time, the conversations about Joseph became less about the circumstances of his death and more about the meaning of remembering someone who had once been left unnamed. His story served as a reminder that even when answers are incomplete, the work of restoring dignity remains important. It was understood that naming him had not erased the pain of what had happened, nor had it filled in all the missing pieces of his life, but it had closed a long period of silence with respect, and it had placed him where he had always belonged, among the names of the known, among the lives carried forward by those who remember. Joseph's grave, now bearing his full name, continued to stand as a quiet marker of that memory. Through seasons of change, through the slow movement of time, his story remained part of the city's living history. The boy who had once been unknown was no longer hidden by time. He was seen, he was known, and he was remembered in the place where his life had first been found.